Very well. Good to see you, Charles.
Good to see you as well. All right, let me just go to my taping here, and then we'll go live on YouTube.
We loved the previous interview you did with me. We've been posting it on our social media. I think it went up yesterday. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Being recorded. All right, let me go live on YouTube. Yeah, I really admire your work over there and what you're doing.
Thank you. Okay. You're based in Phoenix?
Boston.
Boston. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, they're asking me for a code. Okay, so. All right. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here, Monday through Friday, 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we have a return visit from Stephen C. Meyer. He is a philosopher of science, received his PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge, former geophysicist and college professor. He now directs Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. And his most recent book is Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on again, Charles.
So, Stephen, the idea of a belief in a creator of the universe, of a divine source, a supernatural source outside of the universe that created the universe and that gave existence and the law, that is something that has been traditionally, and I would even suggest in many cases presently, accepted as part of science, putting aside the particularities of individual denominations, which may approach that principle in different ways. At some point, that was separated into two disciplines. You had a kind of a separation of science and spiritual belief or belief in a creator, in a way that might be comparable to the way Adam Smith and later Karl Marx separated economy from culture. When did that happen, and what was the main impetus behind that?
Right. I think it began to happen in the late 19th century. And Charles Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species was part of it, but there were antecedents to that in Enlightenment philosophy, a particular philosopher named Comte, Auguste Comte, who argued that knowledge, the development of knowledge, went through three phases. First, the theological phase, where we believed in mythical gods and things like that, and then a philosophical phase with figures. He attributed that to figures like Aristotle and Plato, who had ideas about the forms and philosophical concepts, and then finally what he called a positive phase, where we explained everything by reference to scientific laws and based all knowledge on direct empirical observation. He wrote in about the 1840s, and so some of this way of thinking percolated into the practice of science, such that scientists thought that any appeal to creative intelligence was unscientific. And in fact, Darwin, in The Origin of Species, was trying to explain a phenomenon known as homology, the similarity of structure in similar structures being present in diverse organisms. That had long been attributed to a kind of design plan that was reused by the creator in different types of organisms. Darwin said, well, that, he explained that and said as a result of common ancestry, and acknowledged that there was this other explanation out there that to many leading scientists in the day, including Richard Owen, who was a great taxonomist and biologist, he simply said, but that's not a scientific explanation. So he didn't refute it. He didn't say that it was an inadequate explanation. He just simply said it doesn't qualify as scientific. And that was one of the first appeals to a principle that's known as methodological naturalism. The idea that if you're going to be a scientist, you have to explain all phenomena by reference to unguided, undirected material processes, and that you may not appeal to creative intelligence or mind or a plan as part of your explanation. That sounds reasonable to modern ears, but the problem with that is that we may actually encounter phenomena that are the product of intelligence, and therefore we need to be open to following the evidence wherever it leads, and not limiting the set of explanations we're willing to consider to those that are simply materialistic.
Right, and in a sense, what that is classic materialism, that everything can be explained as matter, regardless of how that matter came about. And the real hardcore materialists even view thought as a form of material,
exactly.
Invisible little cells or impetuses that go between people and that emanate out of the brain. And Auguste Comte is considered the father of modern sociology. In his later years, he actually developed what he considered to be a religion, even though it was an atheist religion, and they still maintain one church in Rio de Janeiro. The flag of Brazil is actually his creation, and this idea of creating this one,
I didn't know that. That's fascinating, Charles.
This one universal kind of ideal. And the main thing we can derive from Comte is the scientizing of the dialectic, which came from Hegel. Hegel observed a dialectical process in the universe, which is natural. There are different elements and essences that compete with each other and change each other, but they basically stated, they put it in a utopian context in that you could have a thesis and an antithesis, which would result in a new synthesis, a new kind of man. And that Comte's ideas also were politicized by Marx, who viewed, the stages of human development, going from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to the ultimate goal, which is communism. And that's like when the entire world becomes one gigantic ant colony. And Darwin, who then used this idea biologically, that man was evolving, an evolving species, and that the lesser evolved species, whom he viewed, frankly, as African Americans and as Black people and as anyone who was not Anglo-Saxon, they would fall by the wayside eventually, or they would have to be managed by this superior species, or what Darwin openly called race. And eventually out would pop this new human species, ultimately. And perhaps the more modern vision of that is transhumanism, this development of a new species that combines human and computer elements to create a new kind of man. But the whole premise is based upon the idea that it's a denial of a creator who created, as I would point out, the book of Genesis says, men and women in his image. I mean, there is something that happens that was divine there, that by which we are able to be different than all other living beings because of our ability, frankly, to reason, and our ability to have consciousness and a conscience and a soul, and our ability to speak, the use of language. I mean, the first thing Adam did after he was created was God commanded him to name all of the entities of the universe by language. So these are the things that made us different. And that seems to me to be quite obvious and quite self-evident. It's not an evolution.
That's really true. The qualitative differences between humans and even the higher primates are striking. Our sense of humor, called risibility among
Yeah.
our ability to use mathematics, our
Mhm.
self-conscious awareness, our use of music, our development of music, our the way in which we study science and study animals that don't study us.
Yeah.
And especially the use and the whole question of the origin of language is fascinating, because to produce a language system, there needs to be some sort of communication already in place in order to establish a symbol convention. And this is a really puzzling aspect of the origin of language. Noam Chomsky, the great linguist, whose politics probably are somewhat to the left of yours, Charles, nevertheless has confessed deep skepticism about the Darwinian account of the origin of language. At one point, he described himself as a Jeffersonian creationist. He wasn't getting his creationist ideas from the Bible, but by observation of nature. But he later pulled back on that, but said that the origin of language must occur all in one big jump. It can't be gradual and Darwinian, because you need to have these sort of language structures in place before you can acquire language, and you need to have a symbol convention before you can define a new one. So how does all that get started? It's really puzzling. But our ability to use language is completely unique. And for example, with this question of the origin of language, you could imagine getting a few nouns established, so some associations by pointing at things, tree. But how do you get something like the subjunctive tense? What I would have done is, or the imperative, what you should do is, by pointing and grunting. It's, and what Chomsky showed is that those different tenses are present in all languages. And they seem to be, there's an inherent language structure in the mind that we come with. So how do we explain that from an evolutionary point of view? Building that up gradually seems completely implausible. So it's just one of those incredible things that are unique. One other thing I just wanted to comment on with Comte is that he thought that the explaining things by reference to the laws of nature was the ultimate, that represented a scientific phase or a positive phase in knowledge. But the initial concept of the laws of nature was, as one historian of science has put it, a juridical metaphor of theological origin. The scientists who got the scientific enterprise going in its modern form with their systematic methods of studying nature and describing nature mathematically, I'm talking about people like Kepler and Newton and Boyle and Galileo. These folks, the founders of the scientific revolution, used the metaphor of the laws of nature to express their idea that there was a lawful order to nature that was impressed on nature by the creator, and it was sustained. The orderly concourse of nature was a consequence of God sustaining the universe in its order. Right. So the whole idea of lawful description of nature is a theological idea, and that expresses or it reflects the fact that the scientific enterprise at its inception was conceived of as a theological project. The scientists were attempting to give glory to God by revealing this hidden order in nature. This was part of the motivation for Newton's great work, the Principia. He wanted to show the mathematical principles that underlie natural phenomena. Kepler, very much the same. He said he was thinking God's thoughts after him as he described the planetary motions. So this idea that explaining things by laws alone without reference to any theological background or without thinking about what the laws are as an expression of God's constant ordering of nature is a late onset idea in the 19th century, but it does then give rise to this whole approach to science that is much more decidedly materialistic and refuses to consider the possibility that we may actually be looking at evidence of a designing mind in the origin and history of life in the universe.
I mean, right. I mean, the whole endeavor was to understand God's universe. I mean, the original scientific endeavor. And by the way, I actually interviewed Noam Chomsky, and I brought this up to him, the fact that and I asked him to please square the peg a little bit in terms of how his understanding of the origin of linguistics would not contradict the evolution. And he had like a meltdown on my show over that. But, it's ultimately, it does. I mean, if it happens spontaneously, then that goes to the idea of of a created universe by a creator, as opposed to an evolved universe where human beings, eventually learn language over a bazillion years. It is basically
Tom Wolfe's last book was
Yeah.
Kingdom of Speech, which was about this whole question of he was deeply skeptical of Darwinian accounts of the origin of language as well. He should be. I was at a conference once where someone was telling about this decisive refutation that Chomsky made in the 60s of the behaviorist account of the origin of language, which is basically stimulus response, and we sort of gradually build up these word associations. And Chomsky then apparently at some point, he did express his skepticism about Darwinian explanations, but then he got kind of pressured and says, well, maybe it could have evolved, but it would have had to evolve all in one jump. And the scientist who was telling me about this conversation that he'd had with Chomsky said, well, then no, why not just call it what it is? ... A miracle. So.
Well, I mean, exactly. I mean, the idea of I think I mentioned last time, and I think you have a similar hypothesis, in that a simple understanding of math, which is an abstract means of understanding entities and essences, leads one to assume that there was a creator of the universe, because you cannot create something out of nothing. A zero, you can't make a number out of zero. 0 plus, minus, multiply, divide, 0 is 0. It can't be 1. It can't be -1. It can only be 0. And thus, in order for nothing to turn into something, which is the universe, there had to have been something outside of nature. And that had to have, we call that God. You could call it a lot of other things, but it just it's something that it's conceivable to the human mind. But there are social and political consequences to denying this very basic axiom, which is.
But the interesting thing is, sorry to interrupt.
Yes, please.
The interesting thing to add to that is that line of reasoning, which seems very sensible to most people, has been supported by discoveries in modern cosmology and astrophysics, that the universe itself appears, as best we can tell, to have had a beginning a finite time ago. We have the evidence of what's called the redshift, the light being stretched out from distant galaxies, indicating that the galaxies are receding away from us. And this was first discovered about 100 years ago by Edwin Hubble and others. Then other evidence from observational astronomy, such as cosmic background radiation, that suggests that the initial state of the universe was very hot and dense, in it, where all the matter had been concentrated. And then developments in theoretical physics showing that as we go back further in time, the matter would have been more densely concentrated, that the reverse of the current cosmic expansion, and that matter, according to general relativity, more densely concentrated bits of matter actually curve the fabric of space. So if you go back far enough, you have an infinite curvature to space, an infinitely dense concentration of matter corresponding to an infinite curvature, at which point you get to a limit. You can't go back any further because space can't compress any further. And
so there had to have been an event. In other words, you could call it the Big Bang, but the point is, even if in the concept of a Big Bang, at what point did it bang? There was nothing and then there was a bang. There had to have been an event. I mean, it didn't happen infinitely. I mean, there had to have been, from nothing had to come something.
If the physical universe has a beginning, and all indications are that it did, then you can't invoke physics to explain the origin of the universe, because there was no physical world before the universe began to do the explaining or causing.
Yes.
Similarly, you can't invoke pre-existing matter, because it's matter and energy, as well as space and time, that come into existence at that beginning point. So that cosmological singularity points to the reality, the need for an external cause or creator to bring the universe into existence. And I argue in the book that positing a transcendent and intelligent creator actually provides a better explanation than any possible materialistic explanation.
Right.
Because the creator as conceived, God as conceived by traditional theists, exists he acts within time, but he exists outside of time, our time and space as well. He transcends the domains of matter, space, time, and energy, and thus has the causal power or capability of bringing the universe into existence. Or he exists separately from the universe, which is one of the attributes of any necessary cause of the origin of the universe.
That's right. I mean, he separated the universe from himself. However it happened, it's a mystery. But, Darwin explained the origin of life by saying that everything came out of a little warm pond in his diaries. And does that really explain this incredible intricacy of every living being, all the way from the amoeba up to the human being, with its millions of aspects of perfectly aligned entities all interacting perfectly with each other? I mean, can that simply be explained by somehow non-life crashing into each other to form life? It doesn't really make sense. And also, we could use an example, the human eye. If you look at, we can understand scientifically all of the facets of that eye, but yet nothing can explain at what moment can that eye see. There is something miraculous going on when you take a breath and you are experiencing the degree of the universe that every individual experiences. It's self-evident.
Well, that issue of conscious awareness is something I had the Sir John Eccles, the Nobel laureate in neurophysiology. I had a chance to interview him when I was a very young scientist, and he explained that the mystery of perception is profound, because we can track the radiant energy of light going back to the optic nerve, and he says it's tapping away until you get back, and you go back so far. But then he said, what explains the image? What explains our actual experience of red or yellow or green, or the perception of a tree? He says somehow the mind is decoding that physical signal and producing this conscious awareness. And he says that's a complete and total mystery.
Right.
He was an advocate of what's called mind-body interactionism, a form of dualist. That there is a brain, but there is also a mind that is using the brain. He wrote a book with Karl Popper called The Self and Its Brain. But back to the question of the origin of life, which you first raised.
Yeah.
That's you kindly had me on before, so I focused on three big discoveries that have occurred in the last 100 years in science. The discovery first, that as best we can tell, the universe had a beginning. Secondly, the discovery that the universe has been fine-tuned against all odds and for no underlying physical reason to allow for the possibility of life. And the third is the evidence we have about the presence of complex digital and nanotechnology inside living cells, with the discovery that information, the DNA molecule, contains information in a rigorous sense that makes life possible, and which was necessary to the production of the first life. And that question of the origin of life is a huge unsolved mystery within the framework of evolutionary theory. Many people don't know that Darwin in The Origin of Species didn't address it. He did, as you're right. He speculated about life arising from some simple chemicals in a warm little pond in a letter to a friend, Joseph Hooker, but never developed any kind of detailed theory about the origin of life. And in the 160 years plus since then, scientists have been unable to account for the origin of the first life from chemical, as a consequence of what's called chemical evolution. And the main reason for that is that the simple cell, as it was presumed to be in the 19th century, has turned out to be not so simple at all. And that it contains, even the very simplest cells contain complex specified information, functional information, and a whole information storage, transmission, and processing system that rivals. It echoes our own technology, but supersedes it in its integrated and informational complexity. And these features of the cell are hallmarks of mind. They're things that in any other realm of experience would indicate the activity of an intelligent agent. We know Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Richard Dawkins, the greatest scientific atheist of the world, has acknowledged that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. In a recent tweet, he confessed to being knocked sideways by the complexity of the intricate complexity of the data processing system taking place inside the cell.
Right.
So
And that's a single cell. We're not even
That's a
talking
single
about
cell.
the millions of cells that make up a every human being,
Right.
or every living
we
animal.
know that information and information processing capability in our experience arises from one type of cause, that is intelligence. It arises from very sophisticated minds. So the presence of the information at the foundation of life, I've argued, is an indicator of the prior activity of designing intelligence and designing mind in the origin of life.
So if you accept the concept that life did not just come out of non-life, which is the materialistic idea that two non-living entities clash to each other, suddenly up springs life, which is certainly a magical story. But if you accept the idea that this happened through some element of a supernatural, and you also accept the fact, which is observable, that the human being is different from all other living beings, and that we have a consciousness and we have the ability to reason, then you can accept the fact that there is abstract existence along with physical existence, the accumulation of knowledge, and that part of that abstract understanding is a moral code, and that it's something that does seem to be embedded in every human being. It's probably based upon the first principle, which is survival, but it extends beyond that because of our ability to reason and accumulate knowledge and develop civilizations. We develop an objective moral code that has emerged over many, many millennia. We understand that to honor every individual as a creation of God, as a unique being, is the basis of our order, of a civil order, of what the Greeks called logos, of the moral order. And thus we set up governments, we set up laws that protect the individual from each other, and from the darker side of our nature, the imperfect side of our nature. But I think that when you remove the God hypothesis from the equation, then you're not only are you undermining reality itself, but you're undermining this moral code, and you're replacing it with the arbitrary code made up by people in positions of power who think that they can replace God. That's the great sin of the Garden of Eden.
Well, I had a very interesting conversation about this exact issue with Michael Shermer, the well-known editor of Skeptic magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Michael's a very congenial guy, smart guy, and though decided and convinced atheist.
Yes. Also had a meltdown on my show, but let's.
You must have a knack for that, Charles.
I guess.
But Michael is a moral objectivist. He's not a moral relativist. And so I asked him, well, how do you justify that commitment to moral objectivism from the standpoint of your atheistic worldview? And he, of course, gives an evolutionary account of the origin of morality. And we had a discussion about that. And so I won't tell tales as to who won the argument, because it really wasn't an argument, it was a friendly discussion. But here's my take on that, which I'll give you, which is that I think that if we think of the morality as a consequence, as nothing more, if our moral intuitions that form the basis of that objective moral code, if those intuitions are nothing more than instincts programmed into us by the evolutionary process to aid our survival, as soon as we recognize that our accepting and obeying the moral code runs contrary to our survival instincts, we really don't have any longer any reason to accept the dictates of the moral code. Because if all they're there to do is to promote survival, then if I find in my own case they don't allow they don't promote my survival instincts, then I may decide, well, why should I accept the dictates of the moral code? Mm-hmm. Especially if you give it a very robust Darwinian account of this, that in addition to promoting my survival, they're also the moral instinct is designed to help me propagate my genes and have more offspring and be more successful in the competition for survival of the next generation. Well, if falling on the grenade to save my unit it doesn't do that, then even though I may, out of love for my buddies, want to do that, these acts of altruism that also are part of human experience are not explained by the Darwinian impulse to survival. But there you can weave any number of scenarios that are very realistic, where it's in my interest not to obey the moral code. So I don't think the Darwinian account of the origin of morality survives its own exposure. Once you know that all that is going on with the moral intuition is an impulse to promote the survival of the race, without telling me why human life has value in the first place, I have no real reason to obey the code. All moral systems reflect statements of value. The moral law against killing or against murder reflects the underlying value of human life. But value is something that is only conferred by persons. Only persons can value something. A rock, a planet can't value something. But if the moral code is therefore nothing more than a reflection of diverse human values, you value one thing, I value another, it will inevitably degrade into a form of relativism. And I think relativism is something that is untenable from a practical standpoint. We get a million different moral codes for a million different people that will ultimately degrade into settling moral disputes with power. It's the only way. And none of us live as though morals were completely relative. We might say, I used to teach philosophy in the freshman philosophy class. I'd pass out a survey that would get the students to reveal that they were moral relativists in their philosophy. But when I threatened in a little gag I'd do in class, threatened a very arbitrary system of grading, they all objected and raised their hands and started to argue and say that this wasn't fair.
Sure.
And I very quickly revealing that they were actually moral objectivists. And
that's right.
So if you're a moral objectivist, the source of the valuing can't be all the different human opinions. There must be a singular source of that ultimate value that provides the basis of the moral code. And theism provides an explanation of where what that source is. It's the creator who made all of us in his image and who gave the moral code as a way to promote human flourishing. There is a valuer who's